Alright, so the last video was quite long, and if you have no idea what I'm talking about, there'll be a link to the first video somewhere floating on this screen. But if you do know what I'm talking about and you want to continue working on this pumpkin, we're going to go ahead and finish up some details here, create the cutout for the jack-o'-lantern face, create a shell for essentially the material you'd scoop out of the pumpkin. So, and then we'll go ahead and create a rendering. We'll mess around with the appearances a little bit. And you'll get a little bit more of an idea of how to detail the appearance of a part. But first, we're going to go ahead and hide this out, and we're going to combine out these two bodies. I'm going to go ahead and just throw a selection window over these two bodies and right click and go to combine and just add those together. And then I'm going to create a quick shell. Now this is not going to be entirely accurate. I'm going to go ahead and just select that face and click OK. This of course is going to make it way too thin because that's 0.1 inches. So our shell is going to go into this area. There's things we could do to avoid that to make this more accurate, but it doesn't really matter that much, so I'm going to leave it like that. But I am going to change this thickness. So this thickness is just going to be an inch. You can make it larger if you want. I'm going to go ahead and assume that that's about the amount of space or thickness that the pumpkin grows, and the rest is all those seeds and gunk that you get in the middle. But now that we have that shelled, we can go ahead and show the stem here. And then from here, in terms of geometry, we don't really have much else to do. We have the cutouts for the face. And then one thing I did in the other part was actually use the scale tool on this. And so if you want this to be a little bit more non-uniform, you can scale this with different scales in different directions. And what I mean by that is we can go into Insert, Features, choose Scale, and then we can modify the scale factor. So normally this says uniform scaling. We're going to scale these two bodies. And if I turn uniform scaling off, I can mess around with these numbers. Now if you make these really large, typically you get something that's really kind of weirdly shaped because the scale increases the dimensions quite a bit. Usually something like 1.2 or 1.4 don't sound very large, but they actually end up being quite large. So I actually chose 1.05 for the X and actually shrunk the Z by 4% to 0.96. And I ended up with something like this, a little bit oblong there. And in this case, I'm actually going to flip those dimensions because I drew this up on the right plane, and I think when I created this model initially, I drew it up on the front plane. So I'm going to switch these over, and we'll end up with something like this. Now you can do whatever you want, doesn't matter what shape we create here, but you can always make this, once again, non-uniform in this circular pattern direction for the circular pattern we created before. Now you can create any shape you want or any modifications you want. For example, if you wanted this to be kind of more narrow and tall, you can always change this out and you can have a larger pumpkin. Now you would have to scale this properly. I think if you scale about the centroid, this might not work properly. If you scale it about the origin, we can try that out. And you can see if you scale about the origin, everything moves correctly. So if you scale about the centroid, everything that's not uniform to the centroid is going to move a little bit. So just keep that in mind when using the scale tool. I'm going to go ahead and set this back to 1 as I want to keep it like this. I like this squashed pumpkin look a little bit here. So for this, I'm going to go ahead and create a sketch, and we'll do that on the right plane here. And initially I didn't know what I was going to do with this or how I was going to do this. I was thinking about using the wrap tool or a split line, which makes things a little bit more complicated, but I ended up just deciding to use an extruded cut. And so we can draw this up on the right plane, or we can create an offset plane and draw off of that and then cut from the front. Or when we do actually cut this, we can do an offset for the beginning of the extrude feature and that'll allow us to start from somewhere over here. So either way works. If it's easier for you to visualize a plane off of this, then you can always just drag off or control drag a plane here. Or you can use the offset on the extruded cut tool. So right plane, sketch. And so for this, when I created the eyes, I decided to make this as accurate as possible to what I would actually do in real life. So the eyes would be, they'd look pretty similar but be somewhat asymmetrical. So I'm going to go ahead and draw those in, and then I'll draw in the teeth. So typically when I make these cuts, I usually do an arc for the eye and then like a straight line coming across here and some other arcs and lines that combine that out. And I'm also noticing on the bottom this curve, this internal curve is pretty sharp. If I wanted to change it, I could always change it after the fact, but I'm going to leave that as I'm not too worried about that. But I'm going to go ahead and grab the 3-point arc tool and just place an arc. And then from here I can draw out a line, and then maybe I'll draw in either another arc or a combination of a line and an arc. Maybe I want to drag this down a bit and do a line and finish it off with a 3-point arc. And I actually want this to be a little bit over. So if I select, or if I throw a selection window over this, I can drag this over a bit. And then I can do the same on the other side. I'm going to once again freehand this instead of creating a mirror. And I think this was a little bit easier when I first did this on the other model because there was 15, or there was an even number of slices instead of an uneven number like this. So it's a little bit easier to visualize based on where these curves were. But since this is not symmetrical about this line here, I could always draw up a center line just to make my life a little bit easier if I want. But I'll once again just go ahead and draw down a line. I'll draw out a line from here. And then I can finish it once again with an arc. And I can drag this out a little bit, make it look a little bit more similar to the other one. But yeah, that's something what it would look like. And then for the mouth, I'm going to go ahead and draw in 2 3-point arcs. And with the mouth here, I have a little bit more leeway because I'm going to create a jagged toothed mouth. So how I draw this, no matter how I draw this, it's going to look, or it's going to be hard to tell if it has symmetry or not, so it doesn't matter too much. So I'm going to go ahead and make these construction geometries. And I can draw this out. And I can make this as wide as I want. Doesn't matter too much. So from here, if I want, I can once again fix these arcs so they don't move around. And then I can start drawing in the mouth. So when I drew this in on the other model, I just started kind of going for it and drew this in sort of at random. One of the annoying things you will notice here is that a lot of relations try to snap in. So I'll try to avoid those as much as possible, but not always necessary to avoid those. And hopefully this freehands as well as the first time I did this. It might not. We'll see. You can see there's quite a few lines here, so there's so many relations that snap in. There's probably an option I can just turn off in SolidWorks to not snap to any relations. But right now I'm lazy and don't really care about doing that, so I'll just keep working around the part until I get something that seems mostly reasonable here. I think that looks pretty good. The one thing I don't like is this vertical line here, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that and drag this out a little bit. Maybe drag this in, drag this guy down. So I can modify this however I want. Once I'm happy with that, I can go ahead and just click OK. And then from there I'm just going to go ahead and create an extruded cut. So I'll go ahead and choose out the sketch. If I select it by contour, it'll just pop in the selected contours box. I can just go ahead and delete that out. And then for this, I'm going to go ahead and choose a from option and choose offset. And then we're just going to choose to cut this from an offset. And I'll just go ahead and hold this arrow down until this gets outside of that part. Now I'll start with some sort of arbitrary value and just make sure it cuts through the part. I can see I still have some area here to cut through. And if I want in the cut extrusion, if you do cut further in this part, you might hit the other body, so you can always unselect that body if needed. But in this case, I'll go ahead and add a little bit more than an inch. And that looks like a pretty good cut. If my cut's a little bit too low here, I might want to raise it up because right now it's hitting this bottom surface. And so if I wanted to do that, I can edit the sketch and I can move everything. I can select this and I can move these up. Some things are fixed right now, so I can't do that here. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and actually just delete this feature, but I'm going to take a look at it first. I can see I have an offset of around 8 and a cut of around 5, so I'm going to just keep that in mind for recreating this. But I'm going to go ahead and delete this feature. And just so I don't hit the bottom of the pumpkin, I'm going to go ahead and I'll grab the right plane, control click the right plane and the sketch, and we're going to add something called a derived sketch. So insert derived sketch. And that gives us that sketch, but if you drag anything, it's just going to drag this straight up and down. So we can move it just up a little bit if we want and avoid the bottom of the pumpkin. So again, once again, I'll create an extruded cut. I'll select the sketch first just to make this easier. We're going to choose an offset of 8 inches, and this will be 5 inches. And we'll just choose this body as the selected body. And we can see now this cuts into this area. I'm not going to worry about that. I can always just create an appearance there that's black, that doesn't reflect. That makes it look like that's not there. But you can see we now have that cutout face. Now in the other model, when I showed it at the beginning, it looked quite a bit different than this because the inside faces were set to a black appearance. And some of these other appearances were a little bit different. So we'll go ahead and start with, I'm going to go ahead and black out these areas. So I'm going to control click these faces here. And I'm just going to black them out. So we'll choose out these faces. And you can just rotate this around a little bit to see what would show up if you were to actually change the angle at which you were going to create a rendering. But I'll right click, go to Appearance, Face, and for these we can just choose black. And then we're actually going to modify the underlying appearance. So if you go to Illumination, choose this reflection amount, you can turn this to 0. And when we create a rendering, that's basically just going to show up as flat black. We might need to change it later if it looks too unrealistic, but we'll go ahead and just set that as 0. Now for the faces in the back, we can go ahead and also do similar. We're going to leave a little bit of reflectiveness on these. And once again, we'll choose face. I'll go ahead and choose black. And you can see right now, if you just clicked OK, this is going to be pretty reflective, which wouldn't be really all that helpful in a rendering. We can also black out these areas if we want to. That might be helpful depending on the angle of the rendering. But if we click on this appearance, we can see what's selected, and that's just in this Display Manager tab. We'll go ahead and edit the appearance, and in this selected geometry, I'm going to select out these as well, and then I'll select out this and some of these other faces. And this is a case where if a face isn't facing you, you don't need to select it because it's not going to show up in a rendering or an image as you create it. But you can see if I switch the plain white background, you can see this stuff is quite reflective, and we're going to change that quite a bit. And looking at this face, I don't necessarily like the width of the pumpkin that I'm getting here. So if I did want to change that scale feature, if I didn't want to increase it so much in the Z, I can go ahead and change that back to 1. I could even shrink it a little bit if I want. I could even make this something like 0.9, let's say 8. And that face, if I edit that original sketch, I actually don't like how this isn't a similar point to the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete out a couple of these lines. And then I'll just make this a bit sharper on the top there. And you can see the sketch will update too. The derived sketch will update because it's just derived from that initial sketch. But I can modify this however I like if I want to change this at all. So from here, if I go back into the Display Manager tab and choose this appearance, I can edit it. I can go back into that illumination. And I can change some of the things here. I can change the specular amount. Let's say we reduce the reflections a bit, get pretty low. If we change the specular amount, we can change how kind of diffuse the reflections are. And this luminous intensity option we won't touch, but this one you can actually add essentially light to a surface. So if you add luminous intensity, it'll actually have light coming off of it. Now for this orange appearance, this is probably the most important part, as this is the main body of the part. We can also come into illumination, and I'm going to reduce the reflective amount. And before I modify the other options, I actually changed the surface finish. So if you add a material to the part, or you add something from the appearances tab over here, it'll come in typically with an appearance, or sorry, it'll come in with a texture. And things like this carbon fiber, it also comes in with an image file that's mapped onto there. You can see here. But if you choose just a rubber, for example, it'll come in with a rubber texture. So for the surface finish here, we have an option of choosing some textures. And in this case, I went through the textures, and you can look really closely here, and you can see that most of these aren't going to be any good. Sandblasted might be okay. Obviously, in real life, these wouldn't be the exact appearance, but I ended up choosing this machined appearance. And I thought it looked pretty good for this pumpkin. Now for illumination, we can just keep modifying this a bit. If we turn down the diffuse amount, we're essentially reducing the diffuse reflection off of this face, or those faces. And I could also reduce the reflection. I can turn on blurry reflections, and that'll remove some of that sharpness from that reflection. So if I turn on blurry, that'll become a little bit more accurate. And then I can do similar for the stem. Now for the stem, what I did was I actually selected out all of these fillets and changed the color for the fillets. So if I control click these and go around and choose these, I can set a different appearance for these faces. And the reason for this is a lot of times you'll look at a pumpkin stem and it looks more wooden in certain areas and green in other areas. The green's also speckled a bit, but that's a little bit harder to get in SolidWorks. So we'll just select out these faces. And originally when I did this, I actually had an octagon for this front face, and that gave me a few more lines to work with for these faces that I'm changing. But that's not something I'm going to go back in and change. So if you wanted to experiment with that, you can always change this to having more sides or less sides and see what you get. But in the appearances, I'm going to go into wood, and I can choose pretty much anything here. Doesn't matter too much. As it's going to be a pretty small bit of the appearance, but if I choose a wood finish, it'll give me a little bit more accurate change to that stem. And then for this green's pretty inaccurate in terms of what we'd see. So for the surface finish for this, I found this rough 2 to be a reasonable one to use. And then the illumination, once again, I made blurry. I think I reduced the diffuse amount, but this is something you can also modify while you're setting up your rendering. So unfortunately in the middle of my recording, SolidWorks crashed. So I hadn't saved a lot of those updates, and so I jumped into the other part that I'd created previously and made a few quick modifications to get this to look a little bit more like what we were just working with. But this is relatively the same, so we'll keep working from here. And we were just talking about Photoview. So if you turn Photoview on and you jump into this preview window, you can get a better idea of what this is going to look like in a render. Now before we do this, the last appearance that I didn't add was on the bottom here. If I control select out these faces, I can add another wooden appearance, and that'll make this look more like the actual bottom of the pumpkin that we saw earlier. So I right click once again, choose appearance, face, and in the organic once again we'll choose wood, and I'll just do a polished ash. And when you double click on this while you're in the appearance, you'll see this window. If you drag this, you can change the mapping on the bottom. So if I wanted this to be a finer kind of mesh of what I was looking at, I could do that. I could even add an image here that would more accurately look like, or more accurately represent the actual bottom of this with those kind of divots that it had in it. But from here, if we were to look at the preview window, this will give you an idea of what the actual rendering is going to look like. And a lot of times the model, as you're looking at it on the screen, looks a lot different than what you expect. So here, if I zoom in a bit and I go ahead and open this up a bit, or rather make it larger, you can see the inside comes out quite black. If we wanted to change that, we could. Right now, if you were to zoom in really close, you can see we may want this more orange, we might want this darker, we can make some changes if we want. But if you change the illumination, or if you mess with illumination, then you can get a different result and something that you might like a little bit better. But this isn't too bad for an appearance, especially for a first go. And the last thing I can do here before creating a rendering is if I want to edit the scene, I can do that as well. So we've messed with the appearances on the part, but if you go to edit scene, you can also change the lighting. So if you go into Photoview lighting, you can change, for example, the reflectivity of the scene. If you want to change the background, we can do that outside of this edit appearance. We can jump in and change the background from the pull down, or add in our own background. We can reduce the rendering brightness if we want this to be darker. Reduce the background brightness. We can make this black, for example, if we wanted. or gray or something like that. And then you have this option called environmental rotation, and that's going to change how light reflects off the part, because essentially the sun is considered to be in one direction. So for example, the sun's probably coming from somewhere out here, projected, let's say, off of this face. So if we keep rotating this, we can change the position that the light's coming from. You can also add light sources and do different things. I'm not going to talk about that here. But I kind of like where we had it initially. It gives it kind of like a nice sinister glow on the outside cheek here. And if you do a final render, you can take a look at what that's going to end up looking like. So I'd say I'm pretty happy with this rendering. I could always go in and modify it. If you change the textures on this pumpkin surface or add some features to it, you might get a more realistic appearance, but this is not bad for what we have. But that's how you go about creating this jack-o'-lantern in SolidWorks. If you liked this tutorial and you want to see more like it, hit that like button, subscribe, and there'll be plenty more stuff like this coming your way.